Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on best practices for compliance with EU market abuse regulation, or more, as I'm sure it's going to be called throughout the webinar. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group and I'll be moderating the webinar. Before we get started, I'd just like to share with you a few upcoming events we have that you can see and sign up for at the bottom of the page. We'll be running a webinar on best practices for regulatory reporting on the 16th of July. And then after the summer break, we will host RegTech Summit London on the 3rd of October, and we'll be off to New York for RegTech Summit New York on the 21st of November. Okay, let's press on with the webinar. Our expert speakers today are Jason Shu, Senior Market Abuse Surveillance Specialist at Vanguard Asset Management, Catherine Lehman, CEO at Lehman Crellin, Sean Hurst, EMEA Principal Regulatory Advisor at Smarsh, and Dermot Harris, Senior Vice President, Regulatory Solutions at OneTech. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first just a bit of info for you to make best use of the webinar. On your screen, you'll see we're using Slido, 2 sections, one for polls. We'll be running 3 today, so please do take part in this so we can see where you're at with Mar. And then there's one for your questions. Please put them in the questions panel whenever you'd like to, and we'll answer as many as we can today. So please feel free to join in that way. That would be great. Okay, that's enough of me, and let me ask our speakers to introduce themselves. So Jason, coming to you first.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Shu, and I'm a Senior Surveillance Specialist at Vanguard Group. And I'm currently a subject matter expert in trade surveillance, e-communications monitoring with aspects of personal account dealing at the firm.
Thank you very much. Catherine.
Oh, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Lehman. I am a compliance consultant. I spend my time advising clients on market abuse control frameworks, including surveillance frameworks. I'm a former regulator and former head of banking compliance.
Thank you indeed. And Sean.
Hi, I'm Sean Hurst. I work with Smarsh. We're a communications compliance software technology company. And I'm the subject matter expert around data privacy, regulations, and AI.
Thank you very much. And Dermot.
Hello, my name's Dermot Harris, and I'm head of regulatory solutions at OneTech.
Excellent, thank you. So plenty of experience in the room from different arms of the department that we're talking about. So let's get on with it. But first, let me get started with a poll question. It asks, to what extent has your organization experienced the effects of market abuse? So while you answer that question, let me come to Jason to set the scene and tell us to what extent financial institutions are suffering the effects of market abuse and the key types of abuse, and what's going on internally that things go so wrong.
Yeah, so I think to some extent, I think from a financial institution's point of view as a whole, we do get exposed to market abuse to a degree. But when I think about it as overall, and then I start zooming in on the particular markets, I think that aspect starts to differentiate a bit. So I see potentially a lesser extent of market abuse to, let's say, the more traditional markets of, let's say, cash equities. And when it comes to areas that are newer territories, let's say the crypto space, that area becomes more murkier from that perspective. So it's almost like a scale of exposure to market abuse. And I guess from key types of abuse as well, what we've seen of late from enforcement fines and whatnot, there's a focus keenly, at least for the last 6 months, on insider dealing and lawful disclosures around the world, generally speaking. But these are towards more of the traditional types of, let's say, financial markets. But then we have more of the niche aspects of pumping and dumping for the more nuanced and newer markets. So if we think about meme stocks, crypto, in that area, we have that type of abuse taking place. I think from the areas of potentially what's going wrong internally, I think there's a bit of culture issues that have historically been there, and that's been tackled right now. But more so these days, we are seeing, outside of just simply market abuse, we have controls not being in place and firms being fined based on that alone.
Okay, Catherine, what would you add to that?
I think actually picking up on your last point, Jason, really what I sort of tend to see a lot more of and this is probably my perspective as a consultant, is I see a lot of people struggling with their control frameworks. And actually, if you look back, most firms implemented the market abuse regulation. At the same time, they were implementing vast bits of regulation like MiFID, EMIR, PSD2, GDPR, and we were doing that all at the same time. And resources back then were at breaking point. And so you would expect there to be a lot of teething problems. Then once those complied by dates passed, most firms can be forgiven for heaving a sigh of relief, rolling off the fixed costs, and moving back to what was hopefully going to be a bit of business as usual. And I think that has left behind a lot of pretty lower effort victories for regulators when they come to assess firms' compliance with implementation. If you think about the specific abuses, and again, when I talk to individuals and you talk about specific market abuses, people tend to still leap to insider dealing, and maybe they'll go to front running as a secondary kind of abuse type, but that's it. And actually, depending on asset classes, as you talk about, Jason, I reckon most of us on this panel today could come up with at least 15 or 20 other types of market abuse. And that says to me that there's problems there with our training and awareness. That's not working. If you do a read across, you look at other sectors, say look at financial crime as another really big topic. People leap to anti-money laundering and forget that fraud accounts for almost 40% of all criminal activity in the UK. And in my view, it's the same with market abuse. Training's not worked, and we need to do something different. We need to change the dial.
Okay, fine. Let's see how the audience is getting on here, and let's see the poll results if we may. And Catherine, would you like to comment on that? Ooh.
Yes, that's interesting. And actually, you know what? I think if you talk to most people who face markets, face counterparties, they would probably point a finger in that sort of general direction. They've got a very good nose for what's good, what's not. And I'd say exactly the same for people in terms of looking at their own internal control frameworks. So it's an interesting statistic, but I don't think it really shocks. I think I'd expect people to be saying something like that, because the effects of market abuse can be as much about control failings as much as it is about the actual criminal activity of market abuse.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. And staying with you, Catherine, what are the significant new regulatory drivers of EU market abuse regulation? Some of them are things that people are dealing with at the moment.
Well, if you look back a few years, and actually they publish it every year, ESMA publishes a report on sanctions imposed upon underneath the market abuse regulation. And if you look back a few years ago, very few national competent authorities had taken any enforcement action. If you roll forward to 2024, virtually every NCA has now taken at least one enforcement case in country. Some of them have been against individuals or firms outside of financial services, but the majority of cases were against financial services firms. And that, as I mentioned before, it's relatively easy for an NCA to pick holes in our implementation. On top of that, you've also got a bit of scope change coming in to the European Union from the European Single Access Point, ESAP, which is the one-stop shop for public financial and sustainability related information about companies and investment products. And so I think there's change that will come through that will put enormous pressure again on our original implementation, but actually then challenge how we've done that and how we're capturing our data and information around MAR.
Thank you very much, Dermot, bringing you in here. How do you see the most recent regulatory drivers of MAR?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of sources, actually. One, people, of course, are always looking at the regulatory enforcement actions, and they do look out of region. And this year, there have been some major enforcement actions in the US, for example, which were around coverage. Like, are you covering all of the small venues where you trade? Are you handling all of the data? Are you ingesting all of the data that you should be into your surveillance systems? And I think that has also stimulated a lot of firms in Europe to take a second look at whether or not their coverage is up to snuff. And so we see a certain amount of action there where people are saying, oh, well, we've been doing, spreadsheet-based surveillance of some of the small venues, dark pools, things like that. We'd better get that all automated before the regulators in Europe sort of take the hint from the US and come through with similar enforcement actions. And that has been sort of amplified by a number of the new regulations coming out, which also have been extending the coverage of regulation. So for example, MiCAR, which is extending coverage significantly into the crypto space. And cryptos, to be honest, have always hesitated to spend any money on regulation. Some of them even feel that, well, we're sort of above all of that stuff that fiat markets need and crypto markets evidently don't. But I think they're now coming into line and understanding that actually they do need surveillance and they do need similar coverage, as the fiat markets. So we see a lot of activity because of some of these new regulatory regimes and tweaks to regulatory regimes in the space of reporting, like EMIR Refit and AML and CFT, have been sort of giving notice to firms that they need their data in better shape even than MAR forced them to put it into, and they need to extend their coverage, their surveillance coverage to cover all of these things.
Okay, that's great. That's a lot to take on board. So let's run another poll question. And this one asks, what are the challenges of compliance with market abuse regulation at your organization? And there's only a certain amount we can fit on the screen. That said, multiple choice, please tick as many as you like. I'm not sure that's multiple choice, but please tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, let me come back to Jason to tell us how he sees these challenges as a practitioner when he is facing MAR.
Yeah, so I think going back to Catherine's point on the second question, actually, on we're seeing increasing the amount of fines be across the globe effectively, and that management of that information and ingestion by the firm, by myself, by my team, effectively, that takes man hours and resource in a very limited resource space in surveillance and generally in compliance as well. And I think that piece is one of the biggest challenges in terms of if we're going to be getting ahead of, let's say, the bad actors, how do we do that and implement that? And that first requires learnings as well from what are the fines in relation to and what were the, let's say, the mitigants that were missed out that should have been in place. So certain things like that is a big piece of challenge that I see. Secondly to that, actually, and it's sort of interlinked, is the efficiency of our own surveillance tools and resources as it stands right now. Can we be more efficient with the tools that we use? We use a lot of different systems, and then the question always comes down to, can we make it more holistic such that we don't need to waste a lot of resource hours spending time doing the admin intensive work and make it more streamlined? So those are some of the pieces. And I think Dermot also mentioned about the data mapping exercise. As businesses grow, they go into different jurisdictions, and there may be newer asset classes that we may venture into, for instance. That sort of brings in a different onus on from the initial, let's say, setup for the market abuse regulation scope into now something more. So we need more budget effectively to then have that data quality checks and assurances to make sure those are in check to begin with.
Okay, fine. Dermot, when you're out and about and talking to your clients and so on, what sort of challenges do you see?
Yes, well, a lot of challenges. I think to pick up on a couple that Jason mentioned, there is, of course, the data QA, which you mentioned, which is an extremely good one and a very important one. And we see a lot of emphasis on that, a lot of questions about how to do that better coming from clients. We also see some of the firms struggling from the sheer sort of diversity of the regulatory demands. To give you an example, DORA, simultaneously with sort of refreshes of some of the existing regulatory regimes is putting pressure on some firms where they're simultaneously having to address enhanced requirements of cybersecurity, risk management generally, not just financial risk management or even non-financial risk management, as it's often referred to in the surveillance space, BCP, testing and training, all of this sort of hitting at the same time. And so that's making them rethink some of the ways that they're doing things, because they want to make sure that not only are they doing the right kinds of surveillance and the right kinds of risk management and covering all of the markets, all of the asset types that they have to, automating everything that was previously done in spreadsheets, but they're also having to make sure that it's extremely secure and resilient. And often that's causing clients to question, well, we've been running with our old data centers for a while now, but it's going to be very expensive for us to meet DORA requirements for BCP, cybersecurity, and resilience. Isn't this the time now to move into cloud? And so we also see a sort of second wave of movement into cloud-hosted solutions, whether it's the bank's own cloud account or whether it's a third-party supplier-managed account. A second wave being driven by the anticipation of the issues that DORA will raise or is already raising. So I think there's just a breadth, and also, of course, what we discussed before, which is some of the big enforcement actions that are driving, firms and participants right now.
Okay, that's fine. Please, may we have the results of the poll question, please? And Dermot, coming back to you, or perhaps you'd like to comment on this one. I can understand it. I don't think that's aimed at vendors particularly. It's a very expensive business, and then you pile up the software. So, Dermot, what would you say to those results?
I think, well, it's not too surprising. And I think what is interesting is that if you'd looked at a couple of, some similar surveys, say 2 or 3 years ago, I honestly don't think you would have seen cost at the top. So something is driving. You would have seen false positives. That was like the classic one that was always at the top, which of course is a driver of cost as well. But now people are sort of talking about the cost of the surveillance software itself and putting that at the top. And I don't think you would have seen that a couple of years ago. So what's behind that? Speaking of a vendor, as a vendor, and I think Sean might be able to add to this as well. One of the things that we see is driving the cost of our product as well, inflation. There was a very rapid pace of inflation for a while, which inflation in salaries especially, but also these sort of auxiliary regulatory requirements, such as DORA, that are forcing us as a vendor to address many dimensions of the problem all at once. We need to help our clients with DevOps. We need to help our clients with rehosting their solutions into a cloud platform. We need to help our clients with cybersecurity, with testing and training, with BCP, with all sorts of things, in addition to all the other asset types that they're trying to get under surveillance. And all of those areas where we're helping our clients, plus our clients' increased demands on us for cybersecurity, for proving that the system is resilient and secure, is really forcing us to add staff, and that increases the prices of everything. So I think that may be one of the drivers. And Sean, I'd love to hear Sean's opinion on that.
Well, I'm finding it quite fascinating looking at this chart. Was this multiple options allowed or only one option?
Yeah,
okay.
No, multiple options.
So it's quite interesting, the top one there, cost of required surveillance software, and then towards the bottom, lack of senior management buy-in and budget. I would have thought that would be close to the top, because those would be quite significant challenges.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, we were seeing the same thing. I agree with Dermot. Costs have risen. We're a cloud-based vendor, and costs get passed on to us from companies like AWS. With more features, with more functionality, comes more cost, especially when we start talking about AI. As soon as you start implementing some of that, I think that's a forgotten cost for a lot of people, just how expensive that actually is to run. So there's significant investment there. There's a bit of a dichotomy here as well when you look at cost of required surveillance software, and then a little bit further down, too many false positives. they kind of go hand in hand. Typically, the better surveillance software happens to be a bit more expensive, but also will reduce those false positives. But it's quite interesting to see that that's further down the list. Like Dermot says, this is something we'd normally see towards the top. It's one of the biggest complaints that we get, one of the biggest challenges we get when people are looking at a company like ourselves to replace whatever existing solution they have. They're just spending too long in the day spinning their wheels, not doing relevant work, looking at false positives or even false negatives, which are even more challenging. So yeah, I think this it's an interesting result on this, but the costs are going up. So I guess not too surprising to see that right at the top there.
Okay, thank you indeed. Thank you both of you. And if I may, let me come back to you, Catherine, to talk a little bit about best practice approaches that FIAs can take to achieve a compliance. They have the challenges, they have the ever-changing regulation. How can they approach this?
I think there's probably 3 things that I'd suggest. One is to start with what's in front of you. So we all these days have heaps and heaps of data, transaction reports, trade reports, stores, SARS, conduct, culture, MI, all of that information. We should be able to look through that in order to spot some themes and trends. And that might be amongst key client groups, amongst departments, teams, and just give us some red flags and enable us to ask some questions about, well, what's being done about those red flags, if anything? Are they red flags? Maybe they're just amber, but if you get a combination of them, does that then, when you add all of that together, give you a different story and a different picture? And the second thing I'd say, going back to what I talked a little bit about earlier, which is I think it's really hard doing the day job, and it's very difficult to pause and just take a look back. But I think if we can possibly stomach the idea of doing some sort of post-implementation review of all that work that we did those few years ago, I think it would really pay off. And that doesn't necessarily mean bringing in the Big Four to do a huge drains up kind of project. Most of your project team, most of your day staff, if the project team aren't around anymore, will mostly know where the skeletons are. And so just starting with something really basic like an anonymous survey, asking for people to tell you where the bodies lie, will really, really help get you started on that journey. And then I'd say the third piece I'd say is about training, and you've got to look at your training with a completely fresh pair of eyes. And the way to do that, I find helps people, is to think about maybe 2 or 3 specific individuals, people you can picture and you can name, and think about their job role, and think about why they're one of your key stakeholders, and ask the question, so what would market abuse look like if it were to go across their desk? And then write a training program around that. That gets you away from the sort of what I think of as clickbait, click through, do the mandatory e-learning, tick the box, and get you right onto what matters. What's the delta? What do they need to know for their job?
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Jason, as a practitioner, what sort of approaches do you take?
Yeah, I think what Catherine mentioned, a lot of it really resonates with me in terms of what I do on day to day. And I think one of the things that I can pinpoint as well is that BAU item that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, sometimes having that sit back macro viewpoint and reframe everything. Is our controls or is the controls currently in place, fit for purpose? That sort of reframing, we really do need to sit back and think about the long-term view, the roadmap itself. And I think that aspect is true. And then second to that, I would say the culture of compliance by the firm. That's quite core in terms of how do you have conversations with other business stakeholders and units within the business and company itself, both first line, second line, and third line of defense. You really need a collaboration of all lines of defense to call out the red flags, the gaps, the exposures that, let's say, a particular second line, for instance, may see, but may not see the other side. That first line are seen very easily. And I think those conversations and having those conversations itself really aid in having that strong control framework in place to begin with. And I guess to end on another point is the financial institutions' willingness to put enough resources in the first place. in compliance to enable the correct controls. I think it's no point saying that you can put in the correct controls if you don't have enough resources to put it in the first place. Everyone's only got a set amount of hours in a day to implement something and have a BAU, and it fundamentally comes down to that cost element as well from senior leadership.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to bring Sean back in here to talk about whether now is the time to invest in new solutions and additional skilled resources. What are you thinking there?
I work for a software company, so you'd think I'd be saying now is the time. But actually, I'd say it's the opposite. I don't think now is the time to be investing. There are so many changes happening right now. We've seen the significant uptake of AI, or the latest generation of AI with these transformers, things like ChatGPT and some of these other large language models that are out there. It is bubbling up quickly, and so many changes are coming down the line. Those changes are going to result in, more than what we're seeing right now, which it's impressive what we're seeing with ChatGPT and things like that. But we had a little conversation before this started where I was saying, I think we're going to look back at what we are doing today with tools like ChatGPT as being a bit of a toy in comparison to what is coming down the line. And as part of that, a lot of it is going to move over to some of the software vendors. At Smarsh, we're looking deep and hard at a lot of these mechanisms, a lot of these technologies. So is it the time to invest right now and rush out and buy the latest and greatest? And, there's a new AI tool popping up every 20 seconds or so, it seems. I don't think it is. But I think you should be talking to companies that do know the space, that have a proven track record. I think that it's time to partner with some of these vendors and to see what is going on. But I think more than investing in new technologies and going out and getting the latest and greatest and the shiny toys, rather, like Jason was saying, earlier, look at what you already have today. Look at the controls you have in place today. Reassess them. Look at them a little bit differently. Take into account some of the changes that have come along with these new regulations, some of the changes that we're seeing from a data privacy perspective, and all these different elements. Look at what you have today, what tools you have in place, what controls you have in place, and what policies and procedures you have in place. Because again, like Catherine said, training I think is key to everything, but training has not been done in the right way for quite a while. It has been seen as a tick box exercise. I worked for a large American bank for 15 years, and it was the bane of our lives to receive that email. Oh, it's the latest compliance training we have to do. You wouldn't pay attention to it. You just run through it. You know what boxes to tick. And by the end of it, you get a little star and says, well done, you're done for this quarter. That doesn't achieve anything. It's not teaching you anything. And I think that needs to be reassessed long before you start investing in new tools, new solutions. Not to say that you shouldn't invest in new solutions if necessary, but look at what you have already today before you start jumping to that.
Okay, Jason, would you agree with that, as you pointed out before, and not only the solutions, but also the sort of skilled workers that you need?
Yeah, I think in relation to the actual question itself, it will be very much reiterating what Sean said. There's less of a yes or no answer straight off. I think we just need to step back, evaluate what controls and solutions that we currently have at the moment, and then that will determine whether there's sufficient resource at this moment in time and solutions itself to fit the demands of the business and to maintain compliance. I think once we can answer that question, then the question of is now the time to invest, that becomes a lot more obvious and easier to map out and to scope out better. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dermot, back to you if I may. How can FIs be sure they select and implement software solutions that specifically meet their internal needs as well as their external regulatory requirements now and into the future? Let's assume they are talking to people and they are looking at this kind of thing, that they need to cover both obviously internally, externally, and look ahead.
Sure. Well, and assuming they haven't listened to Sean and they are in the market for new software in the first place.
No, they're just talking to them at the moment in time. They're thinking about it.
But increasingly, actually, to Sean's point, what we're seeing is that our customers are not looking for software. They're actually looking for solutions that address a very specific thing. Like there's a regulation and they want a solution that addresses that, not a piece of software. So more and more often they're looking for services and cloud-hosted services, and I think Sean will understand that perfectly well, as his firm, offers cloud-hosted services of that type. Now, also speaking to that curious cost result in the poll earlier, it's pretty rare to encounter a financial firm that's trying to build DIY surveillance solution or VCOMS capture system. So it's about procuring third-party solutions. And if the business cares about cost effectiveness and getting the best solution for its compliance team, it's very important to keep a tight control over that procurement process and keep it interactive. Banks are especially susceptible to or want to outsource or delegate this process to third parties or internal functions whose objective sometimes seems to be bureaucracy for its own sake, and to come up with strange interpretations of business requirements. What happens when you put an opaque layer between your true business needs and the vendor selection process? Well, I'll give you a few examples of things that we've seen in recent RFPs. For example, an Asian bank told us that they would only consider solutions that were based entirely on AI. Rules-based was prohibited. So that means an AI-based wash trade alert, for example. At the same time, we had to respond to an RFP of a Spanish bank that says, you must certify that your solution does not use machine learning or AI. The AI enthusiast was probably hoping that AI can magically reduce the false positive rate to zero and make calibration unnecessary. In the second case, the fear of AI is probably due to a concern about opaqueness and model control issues that would create some kind of regulatory headaches, maybe even with the EU AI regulation. We see an increasing number of RFPs with 800 or 1,000 requirements that look like they're glommed together from a bunch of wish lists. For example, AI-based models are a must-have. Complete model transparency to a lay audience is a must-have. And this is the same RFP, by the way. User can code their own models, must-have. No code approach, must-have. Support for 27 asset types, including carbon offsets, must-have. Market replay for global markets, must-have. Includes MAR and real-time margin risk and voice analytics, must-have. And 24/7 telephone support, must-have. The responses are then marked by some sort of weighted function of the number of fully supported correct answers. Then the RFP will state somewhere that in the legal section that the respondent agrees that their response must be bound to the contract and their 5-year price quote is final. Now, if you're a vendor like OneTick or Smarsh, lucky enough to be able to provide good coverage of these must-have requirements, you're faced with a conundrum. Do you quote the $1 million a year system that satisfies them all? Maybe that's why some of these software solutions are getting so expensive. But you know that behind the curtain, the buyer has a fixed budget and might end up with a very basic MAR surveillance for 3 essential asset types from the lowest bidder. So how do you come through with your price? So in the end, it's a bit of a crapshoot. And I think buyers sometimes end up with a sometimes random, underpowered, or overpriced result because of their own procurement process. And then there's security. It's seriously important, but the security questionnaires have gone nuts, frankly. And ultimately, the cost of an inefficient security assessment process, those costs are borne by the buyer. My more cynical side sees it this way. In a world where everyone is moving to cloud-hosted SaaS solutions, security is the last stand for in-house IT, the last measure to try to keep systems on-prem. We see an endless stream of 200 and 300 question security assessments from prospects and existing customers, and most of them look like they were created by outsourced IT teams who troll the web for all the security questions and demands that anyone has ever thought of. The process is often completely decoupled from the business and even from procurement. So you'll get to the point where you've quoted, had a bid accepted and signed, and then the buyer sends you a long list of unusual security demands that would increase the cost of the service by $50K per year. We have an existing bank customer that sent us 3 of those in the past year, and they're a small on-prem software license. But their India-based IT team hounds us for proof that our worldwide operations are impervious to nuclear war. So all of these things ultimately feed into the costs. And I think that's something that the business side of banks especially should take into consideration and try to stay very close to the acquisition process to make sure they're getting what they really need.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
That sounds very challenging.
bit of a rant there, but I face those
No,
things
that's
every
okay.
day.
That's okay. Sean, looking at that in a similar but different way, what should people who are buying this kind of solution, what should they be looking for? Because obviously sometimes I think people do miss the sweet spot that they're looking for.
So I'd actually take it a step back before you start looking at the solutions. First, get your house in order in terms of taking a more holistic approach. A lot of solutions out there are multifaceted. Even if you're coming up with a pure compliance play, it's not just your compliance team or compliance department that is necessarily going to be involved in using that product. There are going to be other teams involved. So look internally, get rid of silos, because number one, you're going to get more value from whatever product you choose. If you're going to combine multiple departments to bring in their use cases, you're going to end up with a product that does more with the requirements that are set forward. So I would do that first. Obviously, back to what we were saying before around making sure you know what you have internally already. Oftentimes, we'll actually find out during discovery, for us as a software company speaking to clients, we'll find out during discovery with them that they already have some solutions that do this. They just never knew about it because another department owned it. And that's fine. We're more than happy to say, listen, maybe we aren't the right solution right now, or you have something already in place, or actually what you have in place, you might want to look at repurposing that budget for something better, like our product, and let's look at putting a solution together that suits the needs of that department as well as your department. So I think that's a good way to look at it. The other side, yeah, I agree a lot with what Dermot is saying. There's a lot of requirements put forward. It seems like it's going to go counter to what I just said about the holistic approach, but it seems like these RFPs get made by committee. Everybody gets to have their own couple requirements that they're going to throw in there. And it just seems like they're trying to accumulate as much as possible to challenge the vendor. And that's not really the purpose of an RFP, right? It is to see the suitability of the product for yourselves. So put forward the things that are relevant, the things that are valid, the things that are today, what the requirement is today, not what the requirement was the last time you went through this process. Because that's something we get a lot as well. You look through an RFP and you're looking at some of the requests and it's like, nobody does that anymore. Why are you asking for that? And it's because they just found an old document and they made it version 2 and put in a couple new requirements. That doesn't work. So, I mean, there's a bit of give and take. Us as a software vendor, of course, we want to be entertained by yourselves in terms of these RFPs. We want you to bring in an RFP to us. We want to be involved in the process. But have a little think about how best to structure that, because you're going to get a better response from whichever vendor you end up going with. And it's going to be less work down the line, the fewer questions you have. So.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much indeed. Very interesting. And Sean, staying with you, and we've touched on AI and Gen AI, but how can FIs optimize compliance solutions for MAR? And are these types of emerging technologies going to be a part of it? As you said, watch this space, but what do you expect to see in the space?
Well, so AI is not new. The way we're looking at AI today, the performance has increased 100-fold, 1,000-fold, and the ability to look at more data and use that to train up these models, that came along with things like transformers. So AI has been around for a long time, more so what we'd call machine learning. And what we're looking at today is just an evolution of that. But things are getting better. Things are getting more impressive with the capabilities that are out there. When you have vendors like AWS with their own platform Bedrock, which a lot of people don't really know about, but that's their equivalent to kind of like Copilot, where they're putting forward some real good solutions. I mean, they can host things like OpenAI's solutions, the GPTs and that sort of thing, but they have their own solutions as well. And being able to incorporate that into your platform and being able to incorporate it into your workflow is pretty impressive. And I think, again, it goes back to the performance at scale, because the challenge is if you look at trading, for example, the proliferation of algorithm-based bots that are manipulating the market, that is going to become more and more prevalent as we go forward. We're already seeing this happen, and those are bots that are controlled by some AI models that are able to put forward something that a human could never do, which means you're getting a lot more of this trade data coming through, which means you got a lot more to actually surveil and a lot more to look through and get some insights out of. You can't do that as a human. You need to have some very clever stuff going on behind the scenes that's able to monitor for that. In the sense, we're looking at Gen AI, AI models, machine learning models. So there definitely is a place for that. AI-powered monitoring is going to be, it's going to be just a stock standard going forward, right? You're going to have it. There's no way you're going to be able to look at the amount of data that's coming across your desk. You look at the trade volumes, the changes. If you saw a graph, it'd be exponential with what we've seen, over the last 20 years. So since 2000, if we look at what we've seen over time, trade volumes themselves have increased massively, but you need to be able to meet that demand by using something that's quite clever. One key thing that I think that is very useful as a practical use case here is using things like Gen AI to actually create simulations and training scenarios. We talked about training a little bit. I'm sure we'll talk about it some more during the session. But being able to create dummy data to be able to train these models, hugely beneficial. We use it a lot within Smarsh to be able to create data to train up our models or to test our models. I think that companies should be doing the same thing behind the scenes as well. And that goes hand in hand with what we were saying before, with the previous question about how do you assess these products? How do you assess what tools you're going to be using? Go with the proof of concept, throwing out some data that you're generating through these AI generations models. It's going to be a game changer. It's going to help the process just streamline. So I think those are two things there. I won't go on too much because I'm sure there's going to be more coming across. But I think those two alone are going to be a massive win for us.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Dermot, how do you see these types of emerging technologies? Obviously, AI is very prevalent already, but how will these help with the compliance issues there?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with Sean that the AI is there, it's there to stay, and it's going to be everywhere. It's finding its way into products all over the place. And I think people aren't really thinking about it like existing clients, people who are not creating those gigantic RFPs, but rather are trying to get work done. What they're really looking for is lower false positive rate, more efficient workflow, higher true positive rate. They're not really asking for AI. They're just happy with any approach that delivers those things. So AI tends to be at its strongest when it's kind of under the hood, doing its job and making things more efficient without sort of being in your face. I was recently on a panel with an FCA representative where we were exploring where AI and machine learning are already being used by banks and where they're finding their place in the workflow. And broadly, we ended up breaking it down into three areas. One was pre-alert in the data analysis that triggers alerts, which is an area that Sean in particular would be very familiar with. Post-alert, to provide additional context or ranking, and as an analyst replacement tool, for example, by auto-closing alerts. And I think for ourselves, we think applying AI and ML at the data analysis stage that triggers alerts. And in fact, Sean even invented a level 0, which is data creation stage. You're actually creating the data with AI that feeds the whole process in the beginning. But in that early stage, that offers the best ultimate reward, but it's challenging because of non-trivial issues related to opaqueness, model control, things like that. Raises, it's pretty easy to devise machine learning model that raises interesting alerts, but it's harder to create the framework in which you can understand and trust the model. And then there's the post-alert co-pilot approach. That's the most practical short term. It's actually the one where most banks seem to be active at the moment and doing things. AI offers the possibility of enhancing an existing proven rules-based system by leveraging a lot of context information, for example, behavioral and e-coms and v-coms information of the type that Sean's company deals with a lot. That was not originally used for triggering, but now you add it as context. This can take the form of augmenting the alert with an AI-generated risk profile with behavioral outliers and to improve alert scoring. And then the third, and in some ways the most interesting approach, is the human replacement or auto-close approach. And I think that's the least likely to be smart or useful. and it's the most likely to raise audit flags for a bank. We've already seen big warning shots about what a bad idea it can be. For example, the robo-debt scandal in Australia. The fallout from that is still falling. It wasn't about trade surveillance, but the machine was making unsupervised decisions that were life-changing and totally wrong. And you have cases already in the US where bank clients are being debanked by AI models, and there's no one they can talk to because every human is being replaced by an AI. And that's happening now. And then closely related, this auto-close idea where AI is closing alerts that were raised by an existing surveillance system. It's another bad approach, because essentially you're using AI to predict what a human compliance analyst would do based on a history of past analyst actions, and you try to copy that. But the human actions are very noisy data. They can be biased. They're often based on exogenous information like phone calls that the AI doesn't have access to in its training data. So the model you train on analyst actions is probably wrong.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I wonder what we'll be saying about this next year, but let's wait and see on that. And let me take some audience questions now, and back to training. And Catherine, one for you here. It says, I recall Catherine mentions that training is not currently effective in dealing with market abuse. In the group's opinion, what would make anti-market abuse training act as an effective risk mitigant and actually drive the desired behavior? What has worked in other firms?
Great question. I think I would say what works in other firms, and I think what would make it a lot more effective, is to move away from the generic description of, use the FCA phrase, poster child forms of abuse, and think much more about what does something that doesn't look or feel right look like for an individual in a specific role. So it's got to be very role specific. I think the days of what I call the sheep dip training, let's give something very, very high level, 50,000 feet generic, and roll it out to everybody. We know it's not effective, so it's got to be role specific. I think follow that up. And what's really effective is following it up with team discussions. Giving team leaders scenarios that are genuinely relevant to that particular team's role in the organisation, and allowing them a bit of free format, private discussion amongst themselves, amongst their team, is very, very effective.
I think it's a key use case of generative AI as well, creating those scenarios, creating them individualized for each of the teams. I think it's a very good use case there.
Okay, that's great. Moving on and coming to you, Jason, if I may. This one, there are always new risks to cover, but we have a finite budget and resources. So how can we address this?
Might be a cop-out answer, but I say the market abuse risk assessment. You really need a risk assessment to map out all of the concerns. And I think if you were to, let's say, simply have a RAG status of some sort, where you can list out what is the main risk, what is the highest risk posed, then you can tackle that accordingly with the select budget that you do have. I think doing it this way, in a funnel way, where you tackle the highest risk possible with whatever budget you have, that's probably the best approach to take. Yeah.
Okay, same with you, Jason. There's another one associated with this. It asks, how often should firms be doing risk assessments? Obviously, it depends on the firm, but how would you describe that?
Quote unquote periodically, as FCA probably would touch on as well. But I say for myself, we do it probably yearly on that basis, and we probably want that cadence, if not sooner. So I think yearly is almost like the minimum standard.
Okay, fine, excellent. And coming to you on this one, Dermot, I'm going to put two together again, so tell me if you want me to read them again. The first one asks, how can we make sure MAR compliance is on the CEO, COO's agenda so that we can get critical resources? And are board members sufficiently aware and trained on the challenges of consistently addressing regulatory upgrades? So, where is all this going?
Well, as a vendor, that might not be the best question for me, but I can certainly say that. I'm sorry?
Sorry, we lost your sound a moment, but you're back.
I'm back. I'm sorry. Yeah, as a vendor, that's perhaps not the optimal question for me, but I can say that among our clients, who have struggled to get the attention of the CEO and COO. One thing they found effective is, of course, to collate the recent enforcement actions, which tends to get people's attention pretty well, and also to work the cost angle. Because generally, when you are looking to improve your toolkit, you're actually also looking to reduce your costs by improving efficiency. And the combination of those two arguments is tried and true, and it tends to work very well.
I think if I can add to that one as well, in terms of getting the attention of your CEO, the person who holds the budget, I often find people are most successful when they engage a multitude of stakeholders. So that's not reams and reams of people. But if there's a consistent message coming from the key people sitting in an executive committee, a budget holding committee, and they all agree on something, that does mean you've got the hard work of working your way around those committee members. But if they're all broadly saying the same thing, you will almost certainly get your budget approved. It's just you've got to put the work in to get them to the point where they agree there's a problem.
Okay, fine. And Kevin, coming back to you on that sort of question, it says, who should be ultimately responsibility for this type of compliance? Is there a person, a team? It's a difficult one. Nobody wants to be, I'm sure, but should there be someone in the organization who is ultimately responsible?
So I'm going to say something that's probably not, well, I don't know. So compliance has a role as a second line owner. I always strongly believe compliance has to be second line in all of this, so they don't own any of it. The first line owns market abuse risk. And what do I mean by first line? Because that's easy just to go like that. By the first line, what I mean is the people who are facing the markets, the people who are actually facing the original risk, whether that's the clients, the counterparties, the individuals interacting with the market, whomever that is, those are the people who own the risk. Because they are the ones who've made the business decision for the business to be in that particular area and exposing the business to that risk in the first place. It's never compliance.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Sean, one for you, it's something we touched on earlier, but haven't spent much time on it. Says the panel talked about false positives, well, as a result of our poll we did, yeah. This is a real problem for lots of firms. Please, would you wrap up what it's best to do here?
There's no easy answer. I mean, I can tell you the approach that Smarsh takes with our surveillance product. It's constant training and retraining of our models. It is testing and testing and testing. The fact of the matter is we aren't ever going to get rid of all the false positives. That's impossible. If we could, we'd be very, very rich. But to get ahead of the game is just to understand why it's happening. A lot of the time, it's actually a fairly easy fix for people that are using legacy type platforms for this use case, let's say surveilling or supervising against communications data. They'll be using these massive lexicon keyword databases that are just going to catch everything. And they haven't updated those lexicons for years. So oftentimes we'll go in from a consultant perspective and we'll take a look at these lexicon databases they're using, and you'll see some of the original entries in there are from like 1992. Words that typically aren't really going to be used. When we take a look at those, we do a full cleanse. Most of the time we tell them to just get rid of the whole lot and start again, give them some base keywords, and then start working through as an organization, looking at what is specific to each of the use cases, again, including various departments to see, how people are talking, how people are processing data, that sort of thing, and being able to include that within these lexicon. But it's about taking a refreshed approach. It's the same thing as what Catherine has been talking about as well with training. Don't do what you've always done, because you're gonna get what you've always got, right? And it's the same thing with these sort of things. Any sort of surveillance, any sort of monitoring, you need to reassess it on a regular basis. And I don't think that's happening enough.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions, and we are coming close to time anyway, so thank you to our audience for all your questions indeed, and to our speakers for their expert answers. And I'm going to come to the end of my agenda for today, and I'm going to ask all the speakers, if I may, what advice they would offer to practitioners working on compliance with MAR. And Sean, would you like to kick off here?
So my three things are integrate and educate. So it's about removing that.
I say two. Sorry.
Oh, ending two.
No, three. You said three.
Oh, okay. Well, no, it's part of the same thing. Integrate and educate. I think the educate part is, it's looking at all your departments together. Don't just do it in a single form. If you are going to be doing this training, don't just sit there amongst your compliance team and say, okay, what training we're going to do for our folks. Go to your different departments, open it up, and just see how are we going to actually provide a good form of training. How are we going to change this up? How are we going to make people get engaged when they're actually looking at this training, rather than them seeing it as a chore and as something that is just something else I have to do. My manager's going to chase me if I don't. I'm going to get 3 reminders, and if I don't, then I'm going to get called up for a reprimand. That shouldn't be what it is. And how do you change that? That's going to be difficult, but you need to scope it out beyond just one team. One team alone cannot do this training anymore. Tech savvy, I'd keep it tech savvy, but human led. So yes, AI is exciting. There's some amazing stuff coming down the line. Look at what technology is out there, assess the market, speak to the experts, but realize we still need humans in front of those screens for the monitoring, for the expertise, whether you're going to be doing training on these models, whether you're going to assess the benefits of the tools that you're looking at. You need humans in front of that. And don't forget that. Too many people are jumping to AI as the solve all for everything. And then as part of that, I guess it's similar to that, is future focused. Keep looking at what's coming down the line. Keep on top of the news. Have a measured approach at doing it, but keep on top of things. Things are changing so quickly, more than I've ever seen in my entire tech career. That's a long time. I've never seen things change so quickly. So just try and keep on top of that. I battle to keep on top of it. So just do your best. Keep abreast of the news, what's coming down the line, and read between the lines as well, because there's a lot of fluff out there as well.
Okay, over to you, Dan, for some advice, please.
Yeah, well, keep your procurement process close to the business so you'll get less for your money. And remember that the buyer ultimately pays the cost of information security. So be sure your measures are meaningful. Consciously prepare for the AI-based rogue trader, because it's coming. And as a way to be prepared, focus on risk-based approaches to surveillance, because they're more robust in the face of the sort of very fast learning behavior that these trading bots will exhibit.
Okay, that's great. And coming to you, Catherine.
I'd say listen to the narrative. And by that, give you an example. A few years ago, FCA created an enforcement team dedicated to market manipulation. And that happened a few years after there were some clear trends in MarketWatch where they were talking about market manipulation and they were ramping up the messages. And then we get this enforcement team. So I'd say listen to that narrative. I think, Jason, you talked about read across. Think about that and think about what that means for your organization. The second tip I'd have is use the data you've already got, use what's in front of you, but just look at it from a different perspective and look at where that tells you the risk's sitting. And then the third thing I say is find that low-hanging fruit before your regulator or your auditor does. So do that post-implementation review, health check, quick survey, where are the skeletons, and find the information for yourself and get it fixed before someone does it for you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And Jason, some final words from you, please.
Yes, I think market abuse risk assessment, if you don't have one already, you really need to get one done. And that's fundamentally, is it up to date? Does it stand up to scrutiny? Number 2, I would say, do you know how and why you're monitoring for MAR? What are the controls? I think sometimes we get into an assumption that X party is doing something, and after a while, that particular control isn't actually operating. So periodic checks on those particular items is good to know and good to have. And then I guess thirdly, I think some of the panelists have mentioned already, is the horizon scanning aspects of newer developments in relation to enforcement fines, market watches, areas of tech and AI as well. I think the point is that we as practitioners need to know how to use the AI. And in order to know how to use and leverage off the tools, we need to understand it first. So there's no point hiding from it. And yeah, that's my three.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and advice today on this webinar. Thank you to Smarsh and OneTick for sponsoring the webinar. Before we close up, just a reminder of the events I shared with you earlier. A best practices for regulatory reporting webinar on the 16th of July, and then after the summer break, RegTech Summit London on the 3rd of October, and RegTech Summit New York on the 21st of November. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Jason, Catherine, Sean, and Dermot, and thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.